The Greystone Library was supposed to be the perfect job, peaceful, well-paying, and full of stories. I didn't expect one of those stories to be mine. When I came across the job posting, it felt like a lifeline. At 45, I wasn't exactly in the best place. I'd spent most of my life chasing careers I didn't care about, hopping from one cubicle to the next, and always ending up at the same dead end. The idea of being a night watchman at an ancient library was a dream in comparison. Just the thought of all those books in one place made the decision easy. The ad was vague but enticing: night watchman needed. No prior experience required. Remote location. High pay. I applied without hesitation. A week later, I got a call from a gruff voice that didn't even bother with pleasantries. "This is Whitaker from Greystone. You're hired if you can start on Monday." And that was that. The drive to Greystone took me deep into the forests of Maine. The roads became narrower, the trees thicker, and the cell service non-existent. It wasn't until I turned a sharp corner that the library finally came into view. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel: massive stone walls, towering spires, and ivy creeping up its sides. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the clearing, giving the whole place an air of quiet reverence. Mr. Whitaker was waiting for me by the heavy oak doors, a thin man with a lined face and an impatient demeanor. He handed me a key in a folder with a few sheets of paper, his instructions clipped and impersonal. "Your job is simple. Lock the doors. Watch the monitors. Follow the rules." I glanced at the folder, intrigued, but he didn't give me a chance to ask questions. "You're here until sunrise. Don't expect anyone else to come by, and don't try calling me if something goes wrong." His words didn't exactly inspire confidence, but the pay was too good to question it. Plus, I'd always been the type to respect rules. Rules make the world predictable, manageable. And after years of chaotic office jobs, predictability was exactly what I craved. Once Whitaker left, I stepped inside and locked the doors behind me. The library was breathtaking. Towering shelves stretched into the vaulted ceilings, filled with books so old they looked like they might crumble at a touch. Stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the marble floor, and the faint scent of leather and paper lingered in the air. It was a place that felt alive, not in a literal sense, but with history. My watchman's station was a small office tucked into a corner near the entrance, furnished with a rickety chair, a desk, and a set of monitors showing various angles of the library. On the desk, I found a laminated sheet of paper. The rules of the Midnight Library. Rule number 1, if you hear someone reading aloud, do not look for them. Rule number 2, keep the reading room lights on at all times between midnight and 4 a.m. Rule number 3, if a book appears on your desk that you don't recognize, return it to the restricted section immediately. Rule number 4, do not touch any book with a black spine after 3 a.m. Rule number 5, if you hear footsteps above you, remain seated and do not look up. Rule number 6, always lock the entrance doors by 11:45 p.m. and never unlock them until sunrise. Rule number 7, if the clock in the main hall chimes more than 12 times, hide in the basement and do not come out until the chimes stop. Rule number 8, never, under any circumstances, open the basement's locked door. At the bottom, written in bold, were the words, "Failure to follow these rules will result in consequences beyond your understanding." I laughed to myself, assuming it was some kind of hazing ritual for new hires. Still, something about the neat handwriting and the way the paper seemed slightly singed around the edges made me tuck it into the desk drawer instead of throwing it away. I spent the first few hours exploring the library, marveling at the sheer size of it. The restricted section was tucked away in the basement, behind a wrought iron gate that looked older than the library itself. I didn't linger there long. The air was damp and cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The reading room was more inviting, with its heavy wooden desks and plush chairs. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself in a book for hours. I made sure the lights were on, as per the rules, though I still thought the whole thing was a joke. As the clock approached midnight, the library grew quieter, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. I returned to the watchman's station and settled into the chair, flipping through the folder Whitaker had given me. It was mostly maintenance logs and camera instructions, nothing unusual. But every now and then, I thought I heard faint murmurs, like someone reading aloud in the distance. I told myself it was my imagination. After all, the library was massive. Sounds could echo in strange ways. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I'd been led to believe. By the time the clock struck 11:45 p.m., I locked the doors as instructed and settled in for the night. My first shift was off to an unsettling start, but I convinced myself it would get easier. After all, rules were meant to be followed. And I intended to follow them to the letter. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful, if a little unnerving. The monitors flickered occasionally, but I chalked it up to outdated equipment. The library was quiet, eerily so, and the only sounds were the faint creaks of the old building settling. I sat in the Watchman station, flipping through a well-worn novel I'd found on the desk. The silence began to feel oppressive, as if the library itself was holding its breath. Around 1 a.m., I heard it for the first time. A voice, soft and deliberate, reading aloud from somewhere in the distance. My first instinct was to check the monitors. I scanned each screen, hoping to catch sight of someone wandering the aisles. There was nothing. Just empty rows of bookshelves, bathed in the dim glow of the chandeliers. The voice continued, the words indistinct but rhythmic, like someone reciting poetry. My curiosity flared, and I started to rise from my chair, intending to investigate. Then I remembered the first rule: if you hear someone reading aloud, do not look for them. I hesitated, torn between my natural inclination to solve problems and my unease at the strange warning. In the end, I sat back down, gripping the edge of the desk to steady myself. The voice grew fainter, as if moving farther away, and then it stopped altogether. The silence that followed was almost worse. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I found myself straining to hear anything: footsteps, whispers, the creak of a door. But the library was completely still, as if the sound had been erased. I told myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps a quirk of the building's acoustics. After all, old places like this had a way of playing tricks on people. At 2 a.m., I decided to stretch my legs and do a quick patrol of the main floor. The library seemed different at night, the shadows deeper and the aisles longer. The chandeliers above cast shifting patterns on the marble floor, and the stained glass windows threw strange, fragmented shapes onto the walls. I kept my steps light, almost tiptoeing, though I couldn't say why. As I passed the reading room, I noticed the lights flickering faintly. Remembering the second rule, I stepped inside and checked the switches. They were already on, but the bulbs buzzed and dimmed intermittently. I waited, heart thudding, until the lights stabilized. The room felt colder than the rest of the library, and I resisted the urge to glance over my shoulder. When I returned to the Watchman station, a small leather-bound book was sitting on my desk. I froze, staring at it. I hadn't brought any books into the room, and I was certain it hadn't been there when I left. The third rule surfaced in my mind: if a book appears on your desk that you don't recognize, return it to the restricted section immediately. I didn't want to touch it. There was something unsettling about the book, its dark cover unmarked except for a single crimson ribbon protruding from the pages. But the rules were clear, and I wasn't about to test them. I picked up the book gingerly, half expecting it to be warm or damp. It wasn't, but the weight of it felt wrong, as if it were heavier than it should have been. The restricted section was in the basement, and I wasn't thrilled about the idea of going down there alone, but I didn't have much choice. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, the kind that forced you to keep one hand on the rail. The air grew colder as I descended, and the faint scent of mildew and old paper tickled my nose. The restricted section was behind a wrought iron gate, its intricate design resembling curling vines and thorny branches. My key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the gate creaked open. The shelves in this part of the library were different, shorter, more cramped, and packed with books that looked older than the building itself. I scanned the spines, their faded titles written in languages I couldn't recognize. The whole section felt wrong, as if it didn't belong to the rest of the library. I placed the book on an empty spot on one of the shelves and stepped back. For a moment, I thought I heard a faint sigh, but it could have been my imagination. I didn't linger. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest, and I hurried back upstairs without looking back. By the time I returned to the Watchman station, it was nearly 3 a.m. I sat down, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The library was quiet again, the monitors showing nothing but empty aisles and dimly lit hallways. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft at first, a rhythmic tapping that echoed faintly from the ceiling. My eyes darted to the monitors, but the cameras above the main hall showed nothing unusual. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, circling above me as if someone were walking on the library's roof. The fifth rule came to mind: if you hear footsteps above you, remain seated and do not look up. I gripped the arms of my chair, forcing myself to stay still. The urge to glance upward was almost unbearable, but I knew better than to break the rules. The footsteps paused directly above me, and for a moment, the air felt charged, as if the library were holding its breath. Then they moved on, fading into the distance. I exhaled shakily, my heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the feeling of being watched never left me. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, I was more than ready to leave. As I locked the doors and stepped outside, the cool morning air felt like a blessing. The library stood behind me, its towering facade bathed in soft light. It looked less menacing in the daytime, almost peaceful. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for me. The following night, I arrived at the library with a mixture of apprehension and determination. I told myself the strange events from my first shifts were just quirks of the old building, amplified by my overactive imagination. But no amount of logic could erase the memory of those footsteps above me or the inexplicable book that had appeared on my desk. I locked the main doors at exactly 11:45 p.m., as instructed, and double-checked every bolt and latch. The library felt different tonight, as if it were waiting for something. The air was heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that hadn't been there before. I shook off the unease and settled into my station. The hours passed uneventfully at first. I busied myself with adjusting the cameras, ensuring all angles were properly visible on the monitors. Occasionally, I thought I caught a flicker of movement on the edge of a frame, but every time I looked closer, there was nothing. I told myself it was just the grainy quality of the footage. Around midnight, my curiosity about the library's history got the better of me. I opened a drawer in the desk and found a binder labeled Incident Reports. The pages were yellowed with age, and the entries were written in various handwritings, some neat and precise, others hurried and erratic. The earliest entries dated back to the late 1800s, detailing minor incidents, missing books, strange noises, unexplained drafts. But as the years progressed, the reports grew darker. One entry from 1923 described a watchman hearing his own name whispered from the restricted section. Another from 1957 recounted a librarian finding every book on a single shelf turned backward overnight. One entry from the 1970s caught my attention. January 14, 1974, Night Watchman reported footsteps above the main hall at approximately 2 a.m. Refused to follow protocol and investigate. Found at dawn, unresponsive, sitting at his desk with his eyes open. Resigned immediately upon recovery. The words sent a chill down my spine. It seemed the library's strange phenomena had been happening for decades, if not longer. I wanted to dismiss the reports as exaggerations, but after my own experiences, I couldn't. At 2:34 a.m., I prepared to leave my station for a quick patrol. As I stood, I noticed something on the monitors. Camera 7, which covered a section of the restricted section, was flickering. The image wavered, showing static interspersed with brief glimpses of the shelves. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Then, for a split second, the camera stabilized, and I saw something. A figure, standing perfectly still between two shelves. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. The screen flickered again, and the figure was gone. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The rules hadn't mentioned anything about shadows on the cameras. My instinct screamed at me to stay put, but my curiosity compelled me to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way toward the restricted section, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The basement stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. When I reached the bottom, the gate to the restricted section stood ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it the night before. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. The only response was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I stepped inside, sweeping my flashlight over the shelves. The books sat undisturbed, their spines gleaming dully in the artificial light. I moved cautiously, every nerve in my body on edge. As I rounded a corner, my beam of light caught something on the floor, a small, leather-bound book with a crimson ribbon. It was identical to the one that had appeared on my desk the previous night. I crouched to pick it up, but as my fingers brushed the cover, I felt a sudden, intense pressure in my chest. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum that pressed against my lungs. The shelves around me creaked and groaned, as if shifting on their own. I stumbled back, clutching the book to my chest, and fled the restricted section without looking back. When I returned to my station, I placed the book on the desk, my hands shaking. The monitors flickered again, and for a moment, Camera 7 showed the figure once more, this time closer to the gate. I didn't sleep that morning. As soon as my shift ended, I drove straight to the town's small library, hoping to find answers about Greystone Library. The librarian, a kind older woman, seemed surprised when I mentioned where I worked. "You're the new Night Watchman?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "Yes," I replied. "Do you know anything about the library's history?" She hesitated before answering. "Greystone has been around for a long time. Longer than this town, even. It was built by a man named Elias Greystone, a scholar, or so they say. But the locals called him a sorcerer. He was obsessed with knowledge, especially the forbidden kind. Some say he built the library to house things that should never have been written down. What happened to him? No one knows for sure," she said, lowering her voice. "He disappeared one night, and the library was abandoned for decades. When it reopened, people started noticing strange things. Some say Elias never left, that he's still there, watching over his collection." Her words stayed with me as I returned to the library for my next shift. I couldn't shake the feeling that the library was more than just a building, that it was alive in some way, and I was nothing more than a trespasser. That night, the clock in the main hall chimed 13 times. My blood turned to ice as I scrambled to the basement, hiding among the shadows until the chime ceased. When I finally emerged, the air was thick with an unspoken threat, as if the library was warning me to leave while I still could. But I didn't leave. I couldn't. Something about the library fascinated me, drawing me deeper into its mysteries. And though I told myself I was following the rules for my safety, a part of me wondered if I was doing it to uncover the truth about what lurked within its walls. Each subsequent night at the Greystone Library felt heavier than the last, as though the walls themselves were pressing inward, narrowing the already confined spaces. Despite my growing unease, I forced myself to return, convincing myself that the rules would keep me safe. After all, I hadn't broken any yet, and I intended to keep it that way. The night began like the others. I locked the heavy oak doors at exactly 11:45 p.m., listening to the resounding click of the bolts echo in the cavernous main hall. The sound offered little comfort. My desk light flickered as I settled into my chair, the list of rules in its usual spot, staring back at me like a warning I was beginning to internalize more deeply. As I adjusted the cameras, I noticed something strange. Camera 5, which covered the corridor leading to the restricted section, seemed to have a faint smudge on its lens. It was minor, almost unnoticeable, but it bothered me. The smudge appeared to pulse faintly, as if something behind it was breathing. I stared at it longer than I should have before shaking myself free of the trance. Midnight came quickly, and with it, a growing sense of unease. The reading room lights flickered slightly but stayed on, adhering to rule number 2. I walked through the library, ensuring everything was in order. The silence was oppressive, as though the building itself was holding its breath. As I passed by the restricted section, I hesitated. The gate stood as I had left it, locked and undisturbed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I told myself it was just paranoia, residual fear from the events of the previous nights. Yet my feet dragged as I walked away, as if reluctant to leave that part of the library unmonitored. When I returned to my desk, I found a book lying there that I hadn't placed. My stomach dropped. It was another leather-bound volume with a crimson ribbon, just like the others I'd found. This one was slightly larger, its cover cracked and worn as though it had been handled frequently over the years. I picked it up carefully, holding it as if it might burst into flames. The leather was cold, unnaturally so, and my fingers tingled where they touched the cover. I thought about returning it to the restricted section immediately, but something about the book made me hesitate. I glanced at the cameras again. Camera 7 flickered, showing static interspersed with brief flashes of the shelves. Then, for a split second, the shadow was back. It stood motionless at the end of the aisle, its form indistinct but undeniably humanoid. I didn't move. My mind raced through the rules, trying to recall if there was anything about shadows or figures in the monitors. There wasn't. The shadow didn't move, but the oppressive weight of its presence filled the room. Finally, the monitor blinked back to static, and the shadow was gone. I didn't take any chances. Clutching the book tightly, I made my way to the restricted section. The library felt colder with every step, the air growing thick and difficult to breathe. When I reached the gate, I fumbled with the key, my hands trembling. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly as I stepped inside, the narrow aisles darkened in a way that felt unnatural. I found the spot where the book should go, an empty gap between two faded volumes, and slid it into place. As soon as the book settled on the shelf, the cold dissipated, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. I turned to leave but froze. There was a faint sound behind me, like the rustling of pages. I told myself it was just the air currents or an old ventilation system acting up. Still, I didn't look back. When I returned to my desk, I found myself shaking uncontrollably. The library was no longer just a job. It was becoming a puzzle, a labyrinth of rules and phenomena that seemed designed to test my resolve. At 2:45 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, this time louder than before. They started above me, as they had on the first night, but this time they didn't stop. They circled the library, moving from one end of the hall to the other, echoing faintly through the walls. I kept my eyes glued to the monitors, my body rigid in the chair. The rules were clear: don't look up. But the temptation to glance at the ceiling was almost unbearable. My neck ached from keeping my head down, and every instinct screamed at me to confirm there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I exhaled shakily, my breath visible in the cold air. At 3 a.m., the cameras glitched again. Camera 5 showed a brief flash of a black spine, a book lying open on the floor of the restricted section. I knew the rule: don't touch any book with a black spine after 3 a.m. I forced myself to stay seated, ignoring the growing itch of curiosity in the back of my mind. By 4 a.m., I was utterly drained, both mentally and physically. My shift was nearly over, but the library seemed intent on wearing me down. As I prepared to leave, I heard it again, the faintest sound of a voice reading aloud. The words were indistinct, as though muffled by layers of fabric, but the cadence was clear. It was slow, deliberate, and oddly melodic. My heart pounded as I remembered rule number 1. If you hear someone reading aloud, do not look for them. I didn't move. The voice grew louder, as if the speaker were walking toward me, though I saw nothing on the monitors. It passed by my desk, the sound wrapping around me like a cold wind, before fading into the distance. When the clock struck 5 a.m., I locked up the library and left without looking back. The sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows over the forest. But even in the daylight, I felt the library's grip on me. Each step toward the library the following night felt heavier, as though some invisible force were pushing back against me. The chill of the air had intensified, and the forest surrounding the library seemed darker, more oppressive. Even the comforting weight of my thermos, filled with coffee and gripped tightly in my hand, did little to ease the growing unease gnawing at my chest. When I reached the oak doors, they looked different, darker, somehow, as if the wood itself had aged overnight. I forced myself to unlock and enter, though the act of stepping inside felt more like crossing a threshold into something unnatural. The library was silent, The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your own breathing sound too loud. I went through the routine motions of locking the door and checking the monitors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air felt heavier, like the library was holding its breath, waiting. At midnight, the reading room lights flickered again. I made my way there cautiously, flashlight in hand, though I was careful to keep my gaze from wandering. The chandeliers hummed faintly as their light returned, bathing the room in a golden glow that felt hollow, like an imitation of warmth. My steps echoed as I walked back toward the restricted section to ensure everything was in place. The air grew colder the closer I got, and when I reached the gate, I saw it immediately, another book with a black spine lying on the floor just inside the section. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Rule number 4 was unambiguous: never touch any book with a black spine after 3 a.m. But it was barely past midnight. Did that mean I could move it now, or was this some kind of test? My instincts screamed at me to leave it alone. I backed away slowly, returning to my desk with the uneasy sense that I had just been watched. At 2:15 a.m., the library began to stir in earnest. The air shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of old parchment and something metallic. The monitors flickered, showing brief glimpses of shadows darting between the shelves. Camera 5, covering the restricted section, glitched repeatedly, the static revealing flashes of movement that disappeared before I could register them fully. I gripped the edge of my desk, willing the clock to tick faster. Then, right on cue, the knocking began. It was soft at first, a gentle tap-tap-tap on the door to the restricted section. I stared at the monitors, my fingers hovering over the controls, but no one appeared on the screen. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the door with both fists. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to stay put. The rules didn't say anything about knocking from the restricted section, but my gut told me to leave it alone. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped, leaving behind an oppressive silence that made the ticking of the clock feel deafening. At 2:34 a.m., I shut off the security cameras as required by rule number 1. The silence during those 5 minutes was unbearable. Every creak of the library seemed amplified, every shadow longer and darker. I counted down the seconds, gripping the edge of my desk until my knuckles turned white. When the cameras came back online, Camera 5 showed the black-spined book in a new position, propped open as though someone had been reading it. My stomach churned, but I didn't move. The night escalated further at 3 a.m. As I sat at my desk, trying to focus on the monitors, I noticed a faint glow emanating from the restricted section. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like moonlight filtering through dense clouds. The glow pulsed, faintly illuminating the edges of the shelves, casting eerie shadows that shifted unnaturally. I couldn't look away. My hand hovered over the radio, unsure whether I should call for help. Then, as suddenly as it began, the glow disappeared, leaving the section in darkness once more. Minutes later, the footsteps began again. This time, they weren't above me. They came from the aisles near the restricted section, slow and deliberate, as though someone were pacing. The sound moved closer, circling my desk like a predator stalking its prey. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding in my ears. The rules were clear: do not look for the source of the footsteps. But the temptation to glance over my shoulder was nearly overwhelming. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. At 4 a.m., I saw it. On camera 7, which covered the staircase leading to the basement, a figure appeared. It was tall and indistinct, its form flickering in and out of focus like a poorly tuned television channel. The figure stood motionless at the top of the stairs, its head tilted slightly as though it were listening. I couldn't move. The figure remained there for several long minutes before descending the stairs, its movements unnaturally smooth and deliberate. It disappeared from the camera's view, but the sense of its presence lingered, a palpable pressure that made it hard to breathe. I spent the remainder of the night on edge, every creak and groan of the library sending jolts of adrenaline through my system. When dawn finally broke, I locked up and left without looking back. Even as I drove away, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The glow in the restricted section, the footsteps, the figure on the stairs, They weren't just tricks of my imagination. The library was alive, its rules a fragile barrier between order and chaos. The next shift began with an unease that had settled into my chest like a stone. Each step toward the library felt heavier, my instincts urging me to turn back, but I pushed forward. The paycheck was too good, and despite the growing terror, I couldn't allow myself to quit without understanding what was truly happening in that place. The library greeted me with its usual oppressive silence, the air inside somehow colder than the wintry night outside. As I locked the front doors behind me, the familiar sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. Every shadow seemed deeper, more menacing, as if the library itself had become aware of my growing fear. I began my routine as usual, checking the monitors, walking the aisles, and ensuring the reading room lights were on. The glow of the chandeliers barely reached the corners of the vast space, leaving dark pockets that seemed to stretch and shift in the periphery of my vision. Shortly after midnight, the first disruption came. Camera 5 flickered to static again, but this time the distortion was more violent, the screen jerking as if something were clawing at the lens. I quickly turned the monitor off, my heart racing as I remembered rule number 5. When I turned it back on, the screen was clear, but a book lay open in the restricted section, its black spine gleaming under the dim light. I didn't move. I wouldn't break the rule, no matter how much curiosity gnawed at me. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, my gaze fixed on the monitor, watching the book as if it might spring to life. The footsteps began at 12:45 a.m., slow and deliberate, echoing through the main hall. I froze, keeping my eyes trained on the monitors, but the sound was different this time. It wasn't just one set of steps. There were 2, maybe 3. They moved independently, circling the reading room before heading toward the restricted section. Then came the voice. It started as a low murmur, indistinct and muffled, as if someone were whispering behind a heavy door. The sound grew louder, clearer, until I could make out the words. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is the curse. The voice was coming from the restricted section, where the book still lay open. My chest tightened, the words sending a chill down my spine. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay put. Rule number 1 echoed in my mind: if you hear someone reading aloud, do not look for them. The voice continued, reciting passages in a language I couldn't understand. Each word felt heavy, vibrating through the air like a low-frequency hum. The chandeliers flickered, their light dimming as the voice reached a crescendo. Then, silence. The air felt thick, almost gelatinous, as if the library itself had been holding its breath. I exhaled shakily, my muscles aching from the tension. At 2:34 a.m., I shut down the cameras. The familiar 5 minutes of darkness stretched unbearably long, each second dragging on like an eternity. The silence was broken by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the basement door. When the cameras came back online, I scanned the monitors for any sign of movement. The restricted section was empty, the book gone. My stomach twisted. Nothing ever disappeared in this library without consequence. At 3 a.m., I began my rounds to check the aisles. The lights flickered overhead as I passed the reading room, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. My flashlight caught movement near the restricted section, a fleeting shadow darting between the shelves. I stopped, my heart hammering, but the space was empty when I turned the corner. I continued down the main hall, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the library's oppressive silence. The basement door loomed ahead, its heavy iron handle glinting in the dim light. That's when I heard it, faint, muffled knocking. Rule number 8 was clear: never open the basement's locked door. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side knew I was there. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the dim beam of light. Then, from behind the door, a voice called out, "Help me." It was a man's voice, low and desperate. I froze, torn between fear and the instinct to help. The knocking ceased, replaced by the sound of shuffling footsteps, moving away from the door and down the stairs. The hairs on my neck stood on end. There were no stairs beyond that door. I fled back to the security desk, my pulse racing. As I sat down, My gaze caught movement on the monitor for camera 7, the one covering the basement stairwell. A figure stood at the base of the stairs, its form barely discernible in the grainy footage. It was tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply stood there, staring up at the camera. The clock chimed once, twice, 3 times. Panic surged through me. Rule number 7. If the clock chimes more than 12 times, hide in the basement. But how could I? The chimes continued, echoing through the library with a bone-rattling intensity. I had no choice. Grabbing my flashlight, I bolted for the basement. The door creaked open reluctantly, the air inside heavy and stale. I descended the stairs, each step taking me deeper into the suffocating darkness. The chimes finally stopped when I reached the bottom. The silence was deafening. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my grip, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When I emerged, the library felt different. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight gone. But the sense of being watched remained, a constant, unrelenting pressure at the edge of my awareness. I survived the shift, but barely. As I locked up and stepped into the cold morning air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the library had been testing me, pushing the boundaries of my resolve. The next night, I walked into the library with a heavy sense of foreboding. It was my final scheduled shift, and though I'd managed to follow the rules so far, the library seemed determined to test me. Each encounter had been more harrowing than the last, as if the building itself were alive, probing my limits, waiting for a mistake. I locked the front doors at precisely 11:45 p.m., the sound of the bolts echoing in the empty hall. The weight of the key in my hand felt heavier than usual, and I hesitated before pocketing it. For a brief moment, I thought about leaving right then and there, walking out and never looking back. But the thought of leaving things unfinished, of not fully understanding what this place was, rooted me to the spot. The air inside felt different that night, charged with a palpable tension that made my skin crawl. Shadows seemed darker, more solid, and the faint hum of the library's lighting had deepened into a low, rhythmic thrum that resonated in my chest. I began my rounds, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. The first hour passed uneventfully, but as midnight approached, a series of unsettling events began to unfold. The reading room lights flickered 3 times in quick succession, a warning I recognized all too well. My pulse quickened as I dove under the nearest table, heart pounding in my chest. The shadows in the room grew longer, stretching unnaturally toward the ceiling, twisting and writhing like living things. The air grew icy, and a faint whispering filled the room, though the words were incomprehensible. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay hidden, to obey the rule. After what felt like an eternity, the lights stabilized, and the shadows receded, leaving the room eerily still. I crawled out from beneath the table, my legs trembling, and continued my patrol. The footsteps began at 1 a.m., faint at first, then growing louder, echoing through the main hall. This time, they weren't confined to the floors above me. They moved erratically, circling the reading room, heading toward the restricted section, then back to the main hall. I froze, gripping the edge of the security desk as the footsteps approached. They stopped directly behind me, the sound deafening in the oppressive silence. My entire body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, but I didn't. I couldn't. Rule number 5 was clear: if you hear footsteps above or behind you, do not look. The silence stretched on, each second agonizing. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I exhaled shakily, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. At 2:34 a.m., I shut down the cameras. The 5 minutes of darkness had always been unsettling, but that night, it felt unbearable. The low thrum of the library's lighting intensified, vibrating through the walls and floor. The sound grew louder, transforming into a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very foundation of the building. When the cameras came back online, I scanned the monitors, my fingers trembling over the keyboard. Camera 5 flickered to static, but this time, it didn't clear. The screen glitched, showing brief flashes of something large and shifting in the shadows of the restricted section. I turned the monitor off, my stomach twisting with dread. The basement door rattled violently at 3 a.m., the sound reverberating through the library like thunder. I backed away from the desk, my eyes fixed on the grainy image of the door on the security monitor. It shook with an unnatural force, the hinges groaning as if they might give way at any moment. Then came the voice again, low and desperate. "Help me," it pleaded, followed by a series of frantic knocks. My hands trembled as I clutched the edge of the desk. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare approach the door. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence that seeped into my bones. At 3:13 a.m., I made my way to the dormitory to count the beds, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. As I reached the end of the hall, I froze. There were 7 beds. My heart plummeted. I blinked, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the 7th bed remained. The sheets were rumpled, as if someone had just gotten up, and a faint indentation marked the pillow. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow and rapid. Rule number 4 was clear: there should only ever be 6 beds. The extra one vanished as I reached the hall's entrance, but the unease lingered, wrapping around me like a vice. The final hour dragged on, each minute an eternity. At 4 a.m., the elevator doors opened, the sound echoing through the library. I stared at the monitor, my blood running cold as I saw a figure standing inside. It was me. The figure was identical in every way: same build, same clothes, even the same expression of sheer terror etched across its face. It stood motionless, its eyes fixed on the camera, unblinking. I tore my gaze away, refusing to acknowledge it. My hands shook as I busied myself with meaningless tasks, anything to avoid looking back at the monitor. When sunrise finally came, the library felt different. The oppressive weight that had clung to the air lifted, replaced by a heavy silence that was almost peaceful. I locked the doors and stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting at my face. As I walked to my car, I glanced back at the library, its towering silhouette bathed in the pale light of dawn. For the first time, I felt like I'd truly survived something, though I couldn't quite articulate what.